Hey guys, tonight we're kicking things off with an absolute classic medieval disaster. One that permanently altered the course of a thrilling sport that was, at one time, the pride of the knights and the spectacle of the crowds. Picture this: the clang of metal, the roar of the crowd, the dust flying as horses galloped toward one another, lances aimed straight at their target. Yes, jousting. It was like the medieval version of NASCAR, but with lances, horses, and a lot more serious injuries. But all that came to a crashing halt because of one person, King Henry II of France. You probably won't survive this jousting story, but trust me, it's better that way. Now, before you get comfy, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy the content, of course. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see how this story is reaching people around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that nice soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1559. A grand event, a royal wedding, and of course, King Henry II of France, proud, athletic, and somewhat tragically overconfident, decides to celebrate his daughter's wedding with a good old-fashioned joust. And not just any joust. No, this was going to be a spectacle. After all, when you're a king, you don't do things half-heartedly. You go big, or in Henry's case, you might just go home in a coffin. Everyone, from his doctors to his wife, Catherine de' Medici, and even the great Nostradamus himself, yes, that Nostradamus, warned him against this reckless decision. Nostradamus had, in fact, written a prophecy predicting that Henry would meet his end in a joust. Something about a jewel and a splinter through the eye. Yeah, pretty on the nose, don't you think? But Henry wasn't about to let a little thing like prophecy stop him. After all, he had survived wars, revolts, and French cuisine, so how dangerous could this really be? So Henry, in all his royal bravado, picked his opponent, Gabriel de Montgomery, the captain of his guard. Now, you'd think someone who was literally employed to keep the king alive might think twice about this. But no, Gabriel, bless his heart, was a man of honor and duty. And if the king wanted to risk his life, well, who was he to argue? The first few rounds of the joust, let's move from jousting and tragedy to a more reflective moment, shall we? Pun intended, of course. Tonight, we're diving into the story of Brother Pierre, a young monk whose vanity would leave behind a trail of smoke, and not the kind that rises up in prayer. No, Pierre's vanity was the type that led to the very first selfie disaster, though his version was far less flattering. In fact, his obsession with his own reflection set fire to the entire monastery. Yes, you heard that right. This is a tale about one monk's narcissism turning into the medieval equivalent of arson, and trust me, this one's a doozy. Now, before we get into the heat of the story, see what I did there? Be sure to take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Not if you're just passing through, but if you enjoy these peculiar slices of history I dig up. And tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let's see how far this historical tale of self-obsession has reached. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's continue our journey into the past. It's the 14th century in a quiet Benedictine monastery in France. Picture it: stone walls, cold cloisters, the hum of prayers echoing off the vaults. The daily schedule is all about silence, humility, and self-denial. Monks were supposed to live simple lives, free of vanity, free of worldly distractions. A place where you'd expect no one to even glance at their own reflection, let alone admire it. Enter Brother Pierre. He was young, handsome, and had cheekbones sharp enough to cut parchment, if you can imagine that. Unlike most of the other monks, who were too busy scribbling manuscripts or contemplating the divine, Pierre had one small flaw: he was obsessed with himself. Now, monasteries weren't exactly known for mirrors. Mirrors were rare, maybe a small polished brass disc here and there, just enough to let you check if your tonsure, the monk's bald patch, was in good form. But not Pierre. He had somehow managed to acquire a full-on reflective mirror, the kind that made the other monks raise an eyebrow. Picture a brass or metal object, polished to a near glass-like shine. Pierre, being the self-obsessed monk he was, would sneak into the washroom every evening, where no one could see him, Now, after those fire-filled reflections, let's take a step into the world of medieval hunting, an aristocratic sport of nobility, where elegance, power, and yes, occasionally sheer incompetence, ruled the day. Falconry was the medieval equivalent of owning a flashy sports car, expensive, impressive, and a complete flex of wealth. Falcons, prized for their sharp eyesight and dramatic swoops, were the bird of choice for the elite, a symbol of prestige. But what happens when one nobleman, in a desperate bid to be different, decides that an owl might just be the next big thing in falconry? Well, buckle up, because this is a disaster that will go down in history. Before we get into that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these wild historical moments. And hey, if you feel like it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's always cool to know how far these medieval misadventures travel. Now dim the lights, and let's slip back into this absurd tale from the past. It's the 14th century in England. Falconry is the king's sport, the noble's sport, the "look at me, I have money" sport. Lords and ladies spend fortunes training their hawks and falcons to swoop through the air, catch prey, and return to their masters. It's an art form, graceful, deadly, and deeply traditional. But then came Lord Geoffrey of Kent, a man who, while undoubtedly confident, was also, well, let's say his vision outpaced his competence. Geoffrey, eager to distinguish himself in the high society hunting circuit, was tired of the same old falcons. Falcons, he reasoned, were too mainstream. What the world needed was something more refined, more unique, an animal that screamed, "I'm different, but also I might be completely out of my mind." So, enter Beatrice, the owl. Now owls, as you may know, are not exactly known for their teamwork or their interest in impressing crowds. They're solitary creatures, nocturnal by nature, and not exactly the kind of bird you want on a royal hunting trip in broad daylight. But none of this fazed Geoffrey. No, he was determined that this owl would change falconry forever. He claimed that owls were smarter than falcons, more dignified, and, most importantly, less common. If falcons were the sports cars of the hunting world, then owls would be the vintage luxury cars, unique, elegant, and effortlessly cool. Yeah, let's just say it's hard to drive a vintage car when you don't know how to steer. During a grand royal hunting event, Geoffrey unveiled his prized possession. The crowd gathered, expecting the usual display of falconry grace, with birds soaring majestically through the air. Now that we've had enough of feathered disasters, let's step into the world of medieval fashion, which, let's be real, was about as practical as a bucket of eels in a rainstorm. The Middle Ages were all about making statements, mostly the kind of statement that says, "I have more money than you, and I want you to know it." So, what better way to show off your wealth and social status than with the most ridiculous shoes imaginable? Enter the crackle, an absurdly long, pointy shoe worn by the nobility. These shoes, designed to stretch a man's ego and his balance, were so long that they became the medieval equivalent of wearing a neon sign that said, "Look at me, I'm rich!" But of course, like every great fashion trend, the crackle wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It was also a disaster waiting to happen. And it only took one man, Sir Reginald of Essex, to turn this ridiculous fashion choice into a full-blown medieval crisis. Before we get into Sir Reginald's embarrassing fall from grace, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We're deep into the chaos of medieval fashion, and there's still plenty more where that came from. And while you're at it, let me know where you're tuning in from, because I'm always curious about who's laughing along with me at the absurdities of history. Now, dim the lights, and let's continue our stroll through medieval nonsense. Picture it, a medieval church, the air thick with incense, the pews filled with nobles and clergy, all dressed in their finest. The church service was the ultimate social event, where you showed off your wealth, your status, and in some cases, your complete inability to function in a pair of shoes. Enter Sir Reginald of Essex, a man whose ego was as inflated as the point on his shoes. Sir Reginald was not one to do things by half measures. While other nobles might have opted for a modest pair of pointy shoes, Reginald decided that more was definitely more. He commissioned a pair of shoes that were nearly 2 feet long. Yes, 2 feet. These shoes, crafted from the finest Italian leather, were adorned with tiny bells, like something out of a medieval circus. The longer the shoe, the higher your status, and Reginald's shoes screamed, "I'm the king of this court." But here's the thing, the crackle wasn't built for subtlety. In fact, the longer the shoes, the more impractical they were. Reginald's shoes were so long that he needed to tie the tips to his knees with little chains just to walk. Yes, that's right, chains. So, not only was he trying to walk around like some sort of walking weapon, but the whole thing was just one small misstep away from a medieval disaster. And wouldn't you know it? That's exactly what happened. One Sunday, Sir Reginald decided to wear his prized shoes to church. Picture him, strutting down the aisle, his shoes jingling with each step like a medieval Santa Claus, looking around to make sure everyone noticed him. But of course, as fate would have it, one of his pointy toes snagged on a tapestry. Now you might think, okay, a little trip, no big deal. But no. Now, if you think we've already seen the height of medieval chaos, buckle up. It's time to dive into one of the most absurd, and ultimately tragic, festivals of the Middle Ages, the Feast of Fools. You'd think that a holiday designed to mock human vanity, and remind everyone of their humble place in God's grand design would be, well, humble. But leave it to the medieval church to turn a simple festival into a chaotic disaster. The Feast of Fools was supposed to be a fun and ironic celebration, a one-day event where the lower clergy would act like their superiors. Imagine a monk dressing up as a bishop, a choir boy giving a sermon, and of course, the clergy blessing anything but the usual holy relics. The idea was simple, a little playful mockery of the established hierarchy, meant to remind everyone that humility was key. But as with most things in medieval Europe, it didn't take long for the event to devolve into something much more ridiculous. Enter Brother Roland, a monk who took the idea of acting like a fool a bit too literally. Before we jump into Roland's Feast of Fools debacle, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. You're about to hear the story of a monk who brought the chaos, so stay tuned, because I guarantee you've never heard of a festival quite like this. And drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. I'm always curious about where in the world this bizarre piece of history has found an audience. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's dive into Brother Roland's ill-fated attempt at turning the Feast of Fools into his personal circus. It's the 12th century, and the Feast of Fools has become a day of loud, riotous celebration. It's like a medieval Mardi Gras, but with way more chanting and far fewer beads. The lower clergy, priests, and monks, who spent most of the year in solemn prayer, finally got a day to let loose. They'd dress up in the finest, or most ridiculous, garb, feast, sing, and most importantly, make fun of their betters. The church had, in essence, given the clergy permission to mock the system, and for one glorious day, everyone in the cathedral could forget about their rank and just be foolish. Brother Roland, however, was determined to be the star of the show. He didn't just want to participate in the Feast of Fools, he wanted to win it. In his mind, the whole festival was a challenge to outdo everyone else in ridiculousness. So, he did what any monk with a flair for performance would do. He stole the bishop's robes and began blessing the congregation with an incense-filled censer, but with a twist. Instead of incense, Roland stuffed the censer with sausages. Yes, you read that right, sausages. The smell alone was enough to make anyone question the divine nature of what was happening. The entire church was filled with the savory scent of cooked meat, which, while perhaps delightful at a feast, was decidedly out of place in the middle of a solemn church service. But Roland didn't stop there. He continued his blessing with what one onlooker described as greasy enthusiasm, much to the confusion and possible horror of the congregation. Wine flowed freely. Someone juggled communion wafers. Honestly, it sounds like a medieval frat party, and not exactly the reverent church service one might expect on a holy day. Naturally, this was hilarious, for a while. The crowd roared with laughter, enjoying the absurdity of it all. For a brief, glorious moment, the cathedral felt more like a medieval comedy club than a place of worship. But then, as always happens with these things, reality came crashing in. The actual bishop, Let's stick with the theme of jokes gone wrong and royal mishaps, shall we? If you thought the Feast of Fools was the pinnacle of royal court disasters, then buckle up, because we're heading into the world of jesters. These poor souls were medieval comedians, except, instead of hecklers, they had executioners. A jester's job was simple: keep the monarch entertained, and ideally alive. But as history often proves, comedy in the royal court could be a dangerous game, and one unfortunate jester would learn that the hard way. Before we dive into Roland Leffel's tragic fate, make sure you like this video and subscribe if you're enjoying the chaos so far. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to hear from people all over the globe, especially when we're talking about things like royal humor gone awry. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's continue our journey into the world of medieval comedy, where one wrong joke could cost you your head. It's the early 12th century, and King Henry I of England is known for many things: his rule, his court, and his, how shall we say, slightly fragile ego. He wasn't exactly a man who enjoyed being the subject of jokes. In fact, he was famously touchy about two things: his authority and his boldness. It was common knowledge in the court that making fun of Henry's power, or even hinting at it, was a dangerous thing. Everyone knew this. It was practically medieval common sense. Just like you wouldn't sit too close to a trebuchet, you definitely wouldn't mock the king's sense of self. But Roland Leffel, the court jester, wasn't exactly known for his tact. Roland was clever, witty, and most importantly, unfiltered. His job was to make the king laugh, but sometimes that meant crossing a line or two. And, as we know, in medieval times, some lines just aren't meant to be crossed. One night, after a royal feast and more than a few goblets of wine, Roland made the fateful decision to approach the king with one of his usual quips. With all the confidence of a man who thought he could make fun of anyone, Roland bowed dramatically before Henry and said, "Your Majesty, I dreamt last night that I saw a shining crown upon your head." The room chuckled. Even Henry, ever so slightly amused, smiled. It was harmless. At least, that's how Roland saw it. But then Roland added, "Though I think it was just a reflection off your scalp." Silence. Now, you'd think this might be a case of a joke falling flat, but no, it was much worse. The room froze. The musicians stopped playing. The courtiers, usually eager to see a jester perform, suddenly found themselves holding their breath. The king's smile, which had once been playful, instantly vanished. It was like watching a building crumble in slow motion. Everything just fell apart in an instant. Henry's face turned to stone. He didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He simply turned to his guards and gave the order to arrest Roland. The next morning, Roland was arrested for slanderous mockery of royal dignity. In plain English, he made fun of the boss. And in medieval England, that could cost you your life. The punishment was swift and, as you might imagine, gruesome. Roland's tongue was cut out to prevent any further comedy at the expense of the monarchy. That's right. This jester's fate was sealed by a joke about a bald spot. And if that wasn't bad enough, King Henry immediately issued a decree banning all jokes at the expense of the monarchy. Laughter in the royal court became a dangerous act, a reminder that humor, when aimed at the wrong person, could be a matter of life and death. The consequences of Roland's ill-timed roast were profound. From that moment on, jesters in the English court were forced to play it safe. Gone were the biting, cutting jokes at the expense of the king or his nobility. Royal humor became sanitized, safe, and well, frankly, less funny. Court jesters could no longer poke fun at the king's expense, which left them with the more mundane task of juggling fruit or pretending to fall down. The golden age of medieval wit, and dare I say, comedy, was over. Now let's move from courtly humor to the realm of medieval justice, specifically, the trial by combat. This was an official system of legal judgment in the Middle Ages, where disputes were settled not through evidence or reason, but through good old-fashioned violence. If two people had a disagreement, whether it was over land, honor, or accusations of wrongdoings, the solution wasn't a court case. Oh no. It was to take up arms and fight it out. The logic behind it was simple. God would choose the innocent party by allowing them to win the fight. Of course, this didn't always work out as planned, but it certainly made for a more exciting and violent way of resolving disputes. Before we get into the trial by combat story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you've enjoyed these wild tales of medieval misadventures. And don't forget to comment with where you're watching from. I love hearing about how far these stories have traveled. Now, let's dim the lights, get comfy, and enter the world of medieval justice, where the stakes were high and the consequences even higher. It's 1386, and we're in France. Two nobles, Jean de Courreges and Jacques Legris, find themselves in a heated dispute over a crime so severe that it demands a trial by combat. The accusation? Legris had allegedly assaulted Courreges' wife, Marguerite. This wasn't just a case of any old quarrel. The stakes couldn't be higher. The outcome of this battle wasn't just about honor. It was about the truth, at least, as the medieval court saw it. Courreges, desperate to prove his wife's innocence and avenge her honor, was ready for the challenge. Legris, of course, didn't back down. Both men, as was tradition, agreed to fight it out to the death, because nothing says fair trial like a medieval duel, right? At the time, the French legal system wasn't exactly based on evidence, facts, or logic. No, it relied on divine intervention to determine the truth. The theory was that God would favor the innocent party, ensuring they emerged victorious in combat. If you won, you were considered blessed by God and thus proven right. If you lost, well, then God had decided that you were in the wrong. It was a strange form of justice, one that didn't exactly prioritize due process or, a solid investigation. But it was what they had in the Middle Ages, and so the duel was set. Jean de Courreges and Jacques Legris met on the battlefield in front of a crowd of nobles, priests, and onlookers. The combat took place outside the city walls, in a specially designated area for trial by combat, where the fate of both men, and by extension, the fate of Marguerite, would be determined. Picture the scene: swords raised, shields ready, a tense silence hanging in the air as the two men prepared to settle things the only way the medieval world knew how, through blood and violence. The duel began with all the pomp and drama you'd expect from a medieval showdown. The crowd cheered, priests muttered prayers for divine favor, and Courreges and Legris went at each other with swords, determined to win the day. For a while, it seemed like the battle could go either way. Courreges, larger and more experienced in combat, seemed to have the upper hand. But Legris, agile and quick, managed to avoid several powerful blows. The fight raged on, with neither man giving quarter. At one point, Courreges even managed to knock Legris to the ground, seemingly on the verge of victory. But then a twist. Legris, with a burst of energy, managed to strike Courreges' leg, severely wounding him. The injury was enough to tilt the balance in Legris' favor. The battle, which had already been a brutal, exhausting affair, suddenly seemed like it was coming to an end. Courreges, bloodied and barely able to stand, was now facing defeat. The crowd's energy shifted from hope to despair as it looked like Legris might claim victory. But this is where things took a turn. The final act of the duel was one that would forever change the course of this particular trial by combat. As Courreges was on the verge of collapse, the crowd fell silent, unsure if the fight had reached its conclusion. And then, in a final, desperate move, Courreges used his last bit of strength to swing his sword and land a fatal blow to Legris. Legris fell dead. And, as per the rules of trial by combat, Courreges emerged victorious. It was, for all intents and purposes, a victory for Courreges and Marguerite. The court, seeing that Courreges had won, declared that Marguerite's accusation had been proven true. If you think medieval people were too busy with jousts and jousting matches to worry about the finer details of life, think again. We all know that hygiene was a bit of a problem in the Middle Ages. No running water, no showers, and only the bravest among them dared to take a dip in the public bathhouses. But for all their filth, these bathhouses were actually places of gathering, social hubs where nobles, merchants, and peasants alike came together to scrub off the grime of everyday life. Or at least they were until Lord Alaric of Burgundy decided to redefine the meaning of personal space and completely wrecked the humble medieval bathhouse for everyone. Before we dive into Alaric's scandalous exploits, make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the chaos so far. Trust me, it only gets more ridiculous from here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these wild medieval stories travel. Now dim the lights, relax, and let's step into a public bathhouse that's about to go off the rails. It's the 14th century, and public bathhouses are where all the action is happening in cities across Europe. Think of them as medieval day spas, minus the hot stones and scented oils. These bathhouses were places for socializing, gossiping, and, well, doing what medieval people did best, complaining about the plague. They were places where the poor, the rich, and everyone in between could mingle, relax, and for once, forget about the Black Death in the air. In fact, bathhouses were some of the few places where men and women, while separated by modesty screens, could interact with one another without the usual social constraints. They were warm, steamy, and full of potential. At least, they were until Lord Alaric showed up. Alaric, you see, was the kind of nobleman who didn't exactly think through his actions. He was rich, bored, and deeply committed to being absolutely terrible in public. One summer evening, Alaric decided to head to the local bathhouse. He wasn't going alone, mind you. He brought several other people with him. Not his wife, not his mistress, not even some friends. No, Alaric's guest list was even bigger than that. He brought several wives of other men, no doubt as a kind of test, to see just how far he could push the boundaries of public decency. Contemporary accounts say he arrived perfumed, laughing, and underdressed for penance. In other words, Alaric had come to the bathhouse for a good time, and nothing, least of all social expectations, was going to stop him. As you might expect, it didn't take long for the bathhouse to descend into complete chaos. What started as a relaxing, normal evening soon morphed into something resembling a scene from a very bad soap opera. Word got out quickly, and within hours people were gossiping about what was going down in the bathhouse. And it wasn't just the bathers who were upset. You see, someone, most likely a servant or attendant, was in attendance who wasn't quite prepared for Alaric's particular brand of debauchery. This someone, unfortunately for them, happened to be a servant to the local bishop. And here's where things get really messy, because after a few too many drinks, this servant ran out of the bathhouse, shouting about what he had just witnessed. Now, I'm sure you can imagine how this turned out. When you're a church servant, and you witness something unsavory involving your lord and several other noblewomen, you don't exactly keep that to yourself. Nope. You run straight to the bishop. The result of this was nothing short of explosive. The church, always ready to condemn anything that looked even remotely scandalous, launched a full-scale investigation. And when I say investigation, I mean biblical proportions. A group of priests and scholars quickly moved in to condemn the unholy mingling of flesh and filth. Alaric, remember, the one who started the whole scandal, was fined, excommunicated, and then forced to build a chapel as penance. But the fallout didn't stop there. Alaric's bathhouse escapades had consequences that rippled out far beyond Burgundy. In the wake of his unsanctioned party, the church issued a new decree that mixed bathing, meaning men and women sharing the same bath, was officially banned across the region. It didn't matter if you were a commoner or a noble, the new rule applied to everyone. No longer would people be able to enjoy the community and camaraderie that came with the shared experience of bath time. The moral panic about Alaric's behavior spread faster than fleas on a rat. We've already covered our fair share of medieval misadventures, but now it's time to talk about food. Specifically bread. Yes, bread, the humble loaf that was, for much of medieval life, the very foundation of existence. It wasn't just food, it was a currency, a lifeline, and occasionally, a weapon of mass destruction. That's right, bread, because in the Middle Ages, something as innocent as a loaf could bring down an entire town. And it all started with a man named Thomas the Baker, who decided to pad his loaves with rocks. Before we dive into Thomas's legendary act of greed, Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying these medieval follies. I promise we're just getting started. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, whether you're enjoying this from the comfort of your own home or secretly laughing at medieval bread crimes while on the go. Now dim the lights and let's knead our way through this tale of greed, rock-filled loaves, and the birth of the baker's dozen. It's London, 1327, and times are tough. Flour is expensive. People are hungry. And what does one ambitious baker do when he's faced with rising costs and desperate customers? If you're Thomas, the answer is obvious: cut some corners. And by cut some corners, I mean, fill your loaves with rocks. You see, Thomas had a problem. Flour was costly, and customers weren't exactly rolling in cash. But rather than raising the price of bread, a dangerous move that might have had people storming his bakery, Thomas had a much more creative solution. He started adding rocks to his loaves of bread. But not just any rocks. These were small enough to hide inside the crust, heavy enough to throw off the weight, and cheap enough to make a massive profit. The loaves, now deceptively heavy, appeared to be a full serving, when in reality, they were barely more than a few crumbs surrounded by rocks. Customers, unaware of this nefarious trickery, were happily buying bread, thinking they were getting their money's worth. But eventually, word got around that people were literally breaking their teeth on bread that felt more like an ancient weapon than food. One particularly unlucky merchant chomped down on a loaf and cracked his tooth so loudly that the town bailiff, yes, the bailiff, heard it from across the market square. Imagine that, a loud crack so deafening it reached the ears of the local authority. That's not your average bakery incident, right? As you can probably guess, this didn't stay quiet for long. People began to talk, and soon, the entire town was buzzing with the news. The baker, it seemed, had been patting his loaves with rocks, and now, people were literally getting hurt. This wasn't just about deceit anymore. This was about public health, about customers losing teeth over cheap flour and a greedy baker. You can imagine the shock when people realized that their precious loaves had been less about sustenance and more about profit margins. Thomas the baker had quite literally made his bread a weapon. But what's a medieval court to do when faced with a bread-based fraud of this magnitude? Well, as medieval courts were wont to do, they got creative with their punishment. And in a moment of both irony and poetic justice, Thomas was tied to a post in front of the market, forced to wear a fake loaf on his head, and pelted with his own inventory. That's right, the townspeople got to throw his rock-filled bread back at him. It's a bit of medieval justice and a bit of medieval irony rolled into one. The message was clear: if you're going to cheat people out of their bread, at least make sure it doesn't end with your own bakery becoming a projectile. Now, the punishment might have been satisfying, but the real legacy of Thomas's greedy bakery scheme lay in the changes it prompted. In the wake of his rocky betrayal, the local council passed a new law that required bakers to add 1 extra loaf to every dozen sold. That's right, 1 extra loaf. This became the baker's dozen. While most of us now think of a dozen as, well, 12 items, thanks to Thomas the baker's trickery, the official measurement for a dozen of baked goods became 13. Alright, now that we've seen bread get turned into a weapon and humor banned for life, let's shift gears and head into the world of music. Yes, you heard me right, music. Because in the Middle Ages, even the sound of a choir could cause a scandal, thanks to a monk with far too much imagination and far too little supervision. Welcome to the tale of Brother Antonius, a 13th century monk from Burgundy who thought it would be a good idea to experiment with something radical: harmony. And by radical, I mean something so blasphemous that it nearly got him excommunicated. You see, Antonius didn't just want to chant in the usual monophonic style. Oh no, he wanted to add a second note. Yes, that's right, a second note. Before we dive into this musical disaster, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you've been enjoying these tales of medieval chaos. And while you're at it, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this wild medieval history is reaching. Now, let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and tune into a medieval tale where one note was all it took to get banned forever. It's Burgundy, France, 13th century. The church's music scene? Well, let's just say it wasn't exactly the top 40. For centuries, Christian liturgy had been dominated by Gregorian chant, slow, single melodies that echoed through the stone halls of monasteries and churches, soothing the soul but not exactly setting the musical world on fire. The monks would chant in unison, their voices rising and falling in a single, monotone line of prayer. It was peaceful, meditative, and above all, simple. It didn't take much to understand it, and no one was terribly upset about the lack of complexity. After all, the church wasn't exactly into jazz, right? Enter Brother Antonius. Antonius was a monk who, like many of us, found the status quo just a little too, well, boring. He was tired of the same old chants and thought, what if we could do something more musical? Something a bit more harmonious? So, one fateful night, while the rest of the monastery was deep in prayer and chanting, Antonius decided to experiment. He added a second note. Now, to us today, this might sound like the beginning of a lovely melody. But to the monks of the 13th century, it was nothing short of sacrilege. According to the Church's principles, the simplicity of Gregorian chant was sacred, unadorned, and to add harmony was to disrupt the holy purity of the music. The very idea that a second note could exist alongside the first was, to them, like inviting the devil into their worship. Antonius, however, didn't see it that way. He tried it again the next day, this time with even more enthusiasm, two-part harmony. And that's when everything went terribly wrong. The other monks, upon hearing Antonius' experiment, froze in horror. They didn't know whether to fall to their knees in prayer or run screaming out of the chapel. Someone dropped a candle. The abbot fainted. It was chaos. To the men of the cloth, this wasn't just a musical experiment, it was a direct assault on divine simplicity. Antonius, blissfully unaware of the musical crisis he had just caused, thought, that sounded kind of nice. The next day, word spread like wildfire through the monastery. The abbot, who had not yet recovered from his fainting spell, was not pleased. He rushed to inform the bishop, who had, as you can imagine, even less patience for a monk trying to turn the choir into a Gregorian version of a barbershop quartet. The bishop, after hearing Antonius' sinful harmonies, declared that what Antonius had done was heresy. The church wasn't known for being tolerant of new ideas, and when it came to music, they really didn't like things to get too complicated. Music had a purpose in the church. It was supposed to inspire contemplation, humility, and prayer, not to stir the soul with complex, multi-part harmonies. So, in an act of musical repression that could only be rivaled by banning jazz decades later, the bishop ordered that Antonius' harmonies be banned. Polyphony, the use of multiple notes, was officially condemned in many monasteries. Antonius, naturally, was reassigned to a silent order as punishment. And while this punishment may have seemed fitting for a monk who was too creative, it was, in the long run, also terribly ironic. Because, as history has shown, Antonius wasn't just a monk with a bad taste in music. No, he was a pioneer, an accidental pioneer of polyphony, the musical technique that would eventually lead to the rich harmonies of medieval music and later, the classical compositions of the Renaissance. The irony here? Antonius was exiled for giving birth to one of the most important movements in Western music history. His sin was to make the church sound alive, to add layers and depth to a world that, until then, had been steeped in one-note prayers. And while he was condemned for it at the time, centuries later, musicologists would look back at his contribution with admiration, acknowledging him as one of the accidental fathers of Western music. We've seen knights, jesters, monks, and bakers wreak havoc on medieval life, but now it's time to talk about a disaster of truly catastrophic proportions. In the year 1212, a young blacksmith apprentice named Geoffrey decided that, for some reason, leaving a fire unattended was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't exactly end well. In fact, it resulted in what would later be known as the first major fire safety regulation in London. Thanks to Geoffrey's delightfully clumsy oversight, London would never be the same. Before we get into Geoffrey's unfortunate, but highly consequential, story, make sure to like this video and subscribe if you're enjoying these medieval mishaps. I promise, this one's got all the drama, and the fire. And while you're at it, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know how far these tales are traveling. Now, let's dim the lights and head back to 1212, when one blacksmith's dinner break set London ablaze. It's a cold, winter evening in London, and Geoffrey, an apprentice blacksmith, is wrapping up his workday. He's been at the forge all day, striking the iron and tending the fire, as any blacksmith apprentice would. But instead of finishing up, Geoffrey's stomach rumbles, and he thinks, "You know what? I'm going to take a quick break and grab a bite to eat." Now, let's pause for a second and acknowledge that, yes, I'm sure we've all been there. The workday's over, and all you want to do is grab some food. But here's the problem. Geoffrey's blacksmith shop was, in fact, a blacksmith shop. And when you work with fire, especially an open flame in a wooden workshop, you need to be a little more careful than just walking away for dinner. But Geoffrey? He wasn't thinking about safety. So, with the fire still burning away in the forge, he took his leave. He stepped outside to grab some food, completely unaware that he was about to change the course of history, and the layout of London. While Geoffrey was out eating, the fire, left unattended, began to spread. Slowly at first, just a few sparks catching on the wooden walls, the straw on the floor, and before anyone could do anything about it, the flames had taken hold of the shop. In a city like London, where most buildings were made of wood, one small spark could easily become an inferno. And that's exactly what happened. By the time Geoffrey returned, it was already too late. When he rushed back to the shop, it was already engulfed in flames. The fire spread faster than Geoffrey could even attempt to stop it. What began as a single workshop soon turned into a full-fledged blaze. The fire ravaged the surrounding buildings, and before long, the entire neighborhood was ablaze. The flames didn't stop there. They began to spread further, devouring entire sections of the city. Soon, the fire reached the warehouses by the riverfront, then the taverns, the homes, the marketplace. And then it kept going. The heat was so intense that the lead roof of St. Mary's Church literally melted and flowed down the streets like molten metal. At this point, it wasn't just a little fire, it was a catastrophe. The fire raged for days, consuming over 3,000 houses, and the total destruction was enormous. People tried to save whatever they could, barrels of ale, furniture, whatever they could drag from their homes. But of course, most of it was lost to the flames. For all its power and wealth, medieval London was now being swallowed by a disaster that was as terrifying as it was preventable. And whose fault was it? Well, Geoffrey's. The Lord Mayor of London, in a panic, declared that from then on, no one was allowed to kindle flame after sunset within the city walls. The medieval equivalent of a curfew, except this one was specifically about fire. That's right, no candles, no lanterns, no torches at night. Everyone was forced to live without the warmth and light of fire after dark. It was the first fire safety regulation in London, and it came straight from the ashes of Geoffrey's mistake. The result was a major shift in how people lived in London. The city had to adapt quickly, navigating its way through a new reality where fire was now a dangerous thing to be handled with extreme caution. Sometimes, in medieval times, people just couldn't resist turning a serious moment into an opportunity for a spectacle, especially when it came to jousting. It seems like no event, not even the somber occasion of a funeral, could escape the chaos of the medieval desire for fun and games. Case in point, the funeral of Duke Raymond of Toulouse in 1241. What began as a respectful gathering of nobility to mourn a beloved duke quickly descended into what could only be described as medieval mayhem, thanks to one ill-timed joust that would go down in history as one of the strangest reasons for banning a social activity forever. Before we dive into this chaos, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying the wild ride through medieval history. Trust me, this one's got a lot of laughs, and a little bit of tragedy. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from. I'm always fascinated to hear where these stories are reaching, whether it's across the street or across the world. Now, let's dim the lights and head back to medieval France, where a funeral became a jousting arena. The year is 1241, and Duke Raymond of Toulouse has passed away. As you can imagine, his funeral was a grand event, a display of nobility, honor, and a lot of expensive food and drink. His funeral procession included knights, ladies, clergy, and nobles, all gathered to pay their respects. It was meant to be a solemn occasion, with the appropriate amount of grief and respect for the departed. However, if there's one thing medieval knights were known for, it was their love of jousting, and this particular event would make jousting the last thing anyone would ever want at a funeral again. Among those present was Sir Aldrich de Vienne, a knight who apparently couldn't resist the temptation to turn even the most sacred moment into an opportunity to showcase his own masculinity. As the mourners filed past Duke Raymond's coffin, Sir Aldrich, feeling the weight of his own bravado, nudged his friend and said, "Wouldn't Raymond have loved one last joust?" His friend, who was evidently as clueless as Aldrich, agreed. And just like that, the decision was made, a joust at the Duke's funeral. Within an hour, lances were fetched, horses were saddled, and the grand memorial service turned into an impromptu jousting match in the middle of the funeral grounds. Now I'm sure you're thinking, surely this couldn't have gone well. And you're absolutely right. The joust didn't exactly go as planned. What started as a casual tribute to a deceased knight turned into complete and utter chaos. As the two knights charged at each other, something went terribly wrong. A squire tripped over the rope that was supposed to keep the coffin in place. Someone missed their target and ended up spearing a tapestry. Worse still, one unfortunate monk, probably just trying to do his job and mourn the Duke, was launched into a puddle of holy water. The coffin, which had been placed at the center of the action, tipped over mid-charge, releasing the late Duke Raymond in a rather unceremonious manner. Picture it, a royal funeral turned into a chaotic medieval version of bumper cars. The knights' horses collided. The entire event collapsed into confusion. The crowd's solemn mourning gave way to confusion, laughter, and panic. People began running, knights were dismounted, and before long, the dignified funeral had turned into a full-fledged melee. Of course, this was not what anyone expected from a noble funeral, and it certainly wasn't what Duke Raymond would have wanted. But the aftermath was even more profound. The clergy, horrified by the disrespect shown at the funeral, decided that this kind of cavalier behavior could never happen again, not at a funeral. An emergency council was held the next morning, and the verdict was clear: no more jousting at funerals. The church decreed that such displays of martial masculinity were inappropriate for the solemn occasion of honoring the dead. And naturally, this ruling spread far beyond just Duke Raymond's funeral. Jousting at funerals became officially banned across Europe. So, thanks to one overenthusiastic knight and his ill-timed joust, Europe saw the end of an era. No longer would knights be able to show off their prowess at the funerals of their fallen comrades. The legacy of Duke Raymond's funeral was not one of solemn mourning, but of a rule that would change medieval funeral traditions forever. The ban on jousting at funerals was enforced far and wide, and for the rest of the Middle Ages, funerals returned to their more somber, respectful roots. No more clashing lances or knights galloping across tombstones. Funerals became, once again, events focused on honoring the deceased. It's not every day you hear about a festival that was banned forever because one monk thought the best way to celebrate was with sausages and greasy enthusiasm. But here we are, talking about the Feast of Fools, a medieval festival that was supposed to bring laughter and humility to the church, but instead ended up as the greatest disaster of medieval humor. And guess who is responsible for the end of a centuries-old tradition? That's right, one monk, determined to outfool everyone, turned an entire church celebration into a full-blown act of blasphemy. Welcome to the tale of Brother Roland and the festival that could have been, but was tragically no more. Before we dig into Brother Roland's antics, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying these medieval missteps. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from people across the globe who are just as fascinated by these wild medieval stories as I am. Now, dim the lights and let's jump into the Feast of Fools, where the only thing more outrageous than the monk's behavior was the church's decision to shut it down completely. The Feast of Fools was meant to be a time for the church to mock itself, and remind everyone of their humble place in the world. It was a day when the lower clergy could step into the shoes of their superiors, giving them the chance to mock the very system that often held them down. For one day, monks dressed as bishops, quierbers preached sermons that usually involved a goat somewhere, and everyone could have a laugh at the expense of church hierarchy and pride. In theory, it was a brilliant way to check vanity and remind everyone that, yes, even the church was prone to a little humility. But in practice? Well, as you can probably guess, it didn't go exactly according to plan. Enter Brother Roland. Roland was not your average monk. He wasn't content with simply wearing a funny hat and pretending to be a bishop for the day. Oh no. Roland had big plans to make this Feast of Fools one for the ages. He took the festival's spirit of irreverence to new levels and made it clear that when he participated in a joke, he went all in. So, Roland stole the bishop's robes, stuffed his pockets with sausages, because why not, and set about blessing the congregation with what one witness described as greasy enthusiasm. Instead of incense, he swung a censer stuffed with sausages, sending the smell of cooked meat wafting through the air. The crowd roared with laughter. This was the perfect fool's feast for sure. Everyone was enjoying themselves. But then came the moment that would seal the festival's fate. Roland, inspired by the chaos, began blessing the congregation with full sacred fervor. Only this time, it wasn't holy words he was offering but sausage-stained piety. The cathedral became less a house of worship and more a medieval comedy club, with people holding their stomachs from laughing, and some even juggled communion wafers, not exactly the most respectful way to handle the body of Christ. But just when it seemed like Roland was having the time of his life, the actual bishop walked in. And if you've ever seen the look on a parent's face when they catch their child doing something they really shouldn't, then you can picture the bishop's face when he entered the cathedral. It was the same kind of look. The bishop didn't speak, mind you. He didn't need to. He just stood there, frozen in disbelief as Roland, amid the laughter, continued his blasphemous routine, sausages and all. The bishop's look spoke volumes, though. The next morning, an emergency council was convened, and the outcome was swift. The Feast of Fools was officially banned by the church. The church declared it an affront to clerical dignity, and beneath the seriousness required of sacred ritual. All because of one monk's idea of humor. From that point forward, the tradition was officially condemned as blasphemous and damaging to the dignity of the clergy. The Feast of Fools, which had once been an outlet for light-hearted, rebellious humor, was no more. The church decided that humor, at least the kind of humor that involved sausage-swinging monks, was just a little too much. The people who had once been allowed to mock their superiors for one day were now, instead, faced with a church that took itself very, very seriously. The joy and laughter that had once punctuated the holy calendar were replaced with somber reflections on dignity, and for centuries to come, medieval Europe would be a lot less funny because of it. The lesson here? Well, if you're planning to revolutionize your church's traditions, maybe leave the sausages out of it. One monk's attempt at having too much fun completely wiped out a tradition of humble mirth for generations. And so, thanks to Brother Roland, the Feast of Fools was no more. Let's stick with the theme of humor, shall we? But this time, instead of a monk causing trouble at a church festival, we're going to talk about a jester who took things just a little too far at the royal court. You know the kind of guy, clever, quick with a quip, and maybe just a little too eager to get a laugh at someone else's expense. His name was Roland Leffel, and he lived during the reign of King Henry I of England. Roland's job was simple: keep the king entertained, keep him laughing, and try not to get on his bad side. And yet, despite this simple premise, Roland managed to do what no one else dared. He roasted the king himself, and that was the joke that would end the golden age of medieval court humor. But before we get into Roland's royal folly, be sure to like the video and subscribe if you've enjoyed these odd tales of medieval mistakes and consequences. And while you're at it, drop a comment about where you're listening from. I love to hear about the places where these stories reach. Now, let's dim the lights and dive into this tale of a jester who took the punchline just a little too far. The year is around 1100, and King Henry I of England is on the throne. Like many medieval kings, he's a man with an inflated ego, an iron grip on power, and a short temper, especially when it came to his crown and his reputation. But there was one man at court who wasn't afraid to poke fun at the king. That man was Roland Leffel, a jester known for his sharp wit and fearless sense of humor. Roland's job was to entertain, yes, but he was also there to remind the nobility that sometimes, even kings need to be knocked down a peg. Roland, you see, didn't have the luxury of tiptoeing around the king's sensitive spots. If anything, he made a sport of it. One evening, after a royal feast full of wine and celebration, Roland, with his usual boldness, approached the king and made what was, at first, a harmless joke. He bent low, bowed, and said, "Your Majesty, I dreamt last night that I saw a shining crown upon your head. Although, I think it was just the reflection off your scalp." At first, the court chuckled. The kind of gentle, nervous laughter you hear when a jester tells a joke that isn't too edgy. But Henry, the ever-sensitive king, didn't laugh. He didn't even crack a smile. The room, sensing the tension, fell into an awkward silence. Roland, however, wasn't deterred. He pushed his luck even further, saying, "Though I must admit, Your Majesty, the crown may have been shiny, but it was also as asterisk thin as your hairline." The silence that followed could have been heard from miles away. The musicians stopped playing. The servants froze in place. The courtiers held their breath. Roland, too caught up in his own humor, probably thought the joke was a good one. But the king? Not so much. Henry I, not known for his sense of humor when it came to jokes at his expense, immediately turned to his guards and ordered, "Arrest the musician." Roland was dragged away, mid-rhyme no less, as the stunned court watched in horror. The next morning, Henry, in a fit of royal indignation, declared a ban on any jokes at the expense of the monarchy, and that was it. No more jokes poking fun at the king. No more witty remarks about the crown. The punishment was swift and brutal. Roland had his tongue cut out to prevent any further comedy, and humor at the king's expense was officially outlawed in the royal court. What did the court learn from this? Well, for one, they learned that humor at the king's expense could literally cost you your voice, and possibly your life. Roland's fate set a chilling precedent for all court jesters who followed in his footsteps. From then on, jesters could only perform routines that flattered the king, made fun of the lowborn, or focused on the general absurdity of life, but not the king himself. Court humor, once a way to offer subtle commentary on power and politics, became tamed and controlled. But the impact wasn't just on jesters. The ban on mockery quickly extended to public speech. In the years that followed, jokes aimed at the king were seen as an act of treason. Laughing at the crown was considered blasphemous, and any jester caught mocking the monarchy was likely to suffer Roland's fate, execution or exile. The golden age of medieval wit ended that night, silenced by one ill-timed royal roast. The lesson here? Don't make jokes about a king's bald spot. It's one of those classic medieval lessons we can all get behind. Thanks to Roland Leffel, the English court quickly learned that humor could be dangerous, especially when it was at the expense of the monarchy. So, the next time someone tells you a royal joke or cracks a witty remark about their leader, just remember, that kind of humor wasn't always so easy to get away with. One jester's misstep in front of Henry I is all it took to end an era of royal comedy, and leave us with a cautionary tale about knowing when to quit while you're ahead. We've talked about medieval mishaps caused by jesters, monks, and even knights, but here's a doozy for you: the last trial by combat in France. Picture this: two men, both armed and ready to fight to the death, not over personal grievances or land disputes, but over something much graver, a legal matter. This wasn't a simple fight over a piece of land or some trivial theft. No, this was a matter of honor and justice, and the two combatants, Jean de Courreges and Jacques Legris, would settle it in front of the entire French court. But before we get into the details of this epic medieval showdown, be sure to like the video and subscribe if you've been entertained by these crazy stories of medieval history. Also, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I love hearing where these tales are reaching, whether you're in the heart of Europe or across the seas. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's dive into a medieval trial that would change the course of legal history forever. It's 1386 in France, and we're at the tail end of the medieval period, a time when trial by combat was still considered a legitimate way to resolve legal disputes. The concept of trial by combat was rooted in the belief that God would guide the victor's hand and prove who was in the right. So, if two men were in disagreement and could not resolve it through normal means, they would fight it out, and God would determine the truth. Sounds fair, right? Well, in this particular case, it wasn't as simple as just some angry men swinging swords over a minor dispute. Jean de Courreges, a knight, had accused Jacques Legris, another knight, of a horrific crime, the rape of Courreges' wife, Marguerite. In a time when women had little agency over their own legal affairs, this was a serious charge. Courreges claimed that Legris had assaulted his wife, and the dispute escalated to the point where the only way to settle it, legally, was through trial by combat. This duel, however, was not just about two men fighting for pride. It was, quite literally, about proving whether Courreges' wife's accusations were true. The French court, after hearing the accusations, was faced with an unusual dilemma. There were no witnesses to the crime, no solid evidence, just the word of one man against another. In this situation, the court declared that the only way to determine guilt was through combat. After all, in the medieval mindset, God would guide the sword of the just man, and the innocent would be victorious. So, Courreges and Legris were called to fight, to the death. The date of the trial was set, and the entire French court assembled to watch the spectacle. It was an event that would bring knights, clergy, and the general public all together to witness an event they hoped would settle the matter once and for all. On the day of the duel, both men arrived in full armor, ready to face each other. Courreges, the accuser, was determined to bring justice to his wife, while Legris, the accused, was convinced that he would be exonerated by the trial and that the sword would favor him. The battle was fierce. Courreges, fueled by rage and the belief that his wife's honor was at stake, fought with ferocity. Legris, a skilled fighter, wasn't about to back down without a fight. The crowd watched, holding its breath, as the two knights clashed in a brutal fight, the sound of clanging swords filling the air. But as the combat wore on, Courreges gained the upper hand. In a final, decisive moment, Courreges managed to wound Legris fatally. The duel ended with Legris lying dead on the ground, and Courreges was declared the victor. But this victory wasn't just a personal one for Courreges. It was a legal victory that had a massive impact on the future of trial by combat in France. With Legris' death, the court officially accepted Courreges' version of events, that Legris had indeed raped Marguerite. But in the end, Courreges wasn't just winning a personal battle for his wife's honor. His victory also spelled the end of the trial by combat as a legitimate form of legal recourse in France. The French monarchy, horrified by the gruesome nature of the duel and the consequences of such a dangerous method of resolving disputes, quietly abolished the practice after this case. It was deemed an unreliable and barbaric form of justice, better suited to the days of the Vikings than the more structured legal systems emerging in late medieval Europe. So, thanks to Courreges' victory, the age of trial by combat came to a close. The French monarchy, though initially accepting the practice, began to implement more reliable methods of evidence gathering and judgment. The people of France would never again have to watch knights solve their legal problems with bloodshed. The moral of the story? Well, aside from not accusing your fellow knights of rape unless you're very sure you can back it up with a duel to the death, it's that the age of trial by combat was finally over. Jean de Courreges may have won the battle, but in doing so, he also helped end one of the most dangerous and strange methods of legal dispute resolution that history has ever seen. And so, thanks to one fatal duel, France's legal system would evolve into something that looked more like what we know today, and trial by combat would go down in history as a thing of the past.